to the Thought Snob Podcast. I'm Paula Swope. Let's get snobby. You won't be sorry that you tuned in today to the Thought Snob Podcast because I'm here with Phyllis Leavitt, and we are about to have a discussion about the mental health crisis in America. Phyllis is a psychotherapist with over 30 years of experience. She holds a master's degree in psychology and counseling from Antioch University. Phyllis is an expert in dysfunctional and abusive family dynamics. She is also the author of America in Therapy, a new approach to hope and healing for a nation in crisis. And in this book, she addresses the nation's mental health crisis, proposing that psychological insights can heal our deep-seated societal wounds. She envisions the entire nation as a patient in therapy, offering tools to foster connection and cooperation. Phyllis, welcome to the show. The timing of our conversation is impeccable because when we scheduled this interview, there hadn't been an attempted assassination on Donald Trump.
Right.
Oh
Yeah,
my goodness.
the timing is amazing, and there's no better time for America to be in therapy. And there's probably no greater call, although we've had many, to really examine how we treat each other and what's not working and what could work.
That's right. And I did a social media video the other day, and I made it after the presidential debate, and a lot of people really resonated with what I was saying, but then there, the small pocket of people that got offended and started attacking me over what I'd said. And all I said, and I kept it wasn't affiliated with either political party. I just said, hey, after last night's debate, this hatred really isn't getting us anywhere because this hatred, I'm 47 years old, and it's more profound than I've ever witnessed it within the political realm. And it's heavy and it's dark. And it's like it's becoming the collective consciousness. And so in my video, I said, we need to counteract that hatred and show these candidates some compassion, whether you agree or disagree with what they're doing, so we can lighten this energy a little bit. Then you came into my life shortly after I made that video. And I was like, wow, because I don't believe in coincidences. Our timing is absolutely impeccable. And the first thing I want to talk about is something that you state in the introduction of your book. And you say that the only revolution we should be funding is a psychological revolution. So would you talk about what that means exactly?
Yeah, really, I think what I'm saying, and I think the whole purpose of my book, America in Therapy, is really that we know in the world of psychotherapy and psychology that violence begets violence. It just, and I think we actually know that as individuals. I don't think you have to be a therapist to know that, but sometimes we don't want to know what we know. And that's part of what the problem is. We talk so much today about intergenerational dysfunction and abuse and neglect and intergenerational trauma. And what causes that? It's all the ways that we hurt each other. It's the horrible things we say about each other. It's the terrible actions that we take against each other. It's physical violence. It's sexual violence. It's discrimination. It's withholding from people the necessities of life. It's holding some kind of moral judgment over them that they can never get out from under. So what is intergenerational trauma? It's caused by all the hurtful things that we do to one another. And intergenerational trauma means it gets passed down from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And I think that's what we're seeing in our country, both on an individual family level, and I can speak to that as a therapist of over 30 years, that the level of dysfunction and overt abuse in many, many, many more families in America than we would like to believe is rampant. and
Mhm.
people are really being hurt in their own homes, not because we're bad people, but because our conditioning really needs to be changed. So when I say a psychological re-evolution, what I mean is I think we have to really become aware that how we're treating one another, whether it's in our own homes or in our schools or in our places of business or our houses of worship or our communities or our country, many of the ways we're treating each other aren't working. They're
Right.
producing more pain and more acting out.
Because those like energies attract like energies. And so when people are so laser focused on hating one person and you get that, on a wide scale, then the next thing you know, things are manifesting that none of us want. And it's just toxic people, places, and things. And then it turns into this vicious cycle.
And in the world of therapy and psychology, we know that we tend to repeat without intervention, without help, we tend to repeat what we know. Not everybody does that. There are people who, for some, reason that we don't necessarily understand, break the cycle of dysfunction all on their own. But for most people, that's not true. For most people, if you've learned to be submissive because you've been overpowered by a dominating, hurtful force, authority person, you tend to internalize some kind of submissiveness because you had to survive. It's not a flaw. We tend to look at people through this lens of blame and shame. Why were you so passive? Why didn't you stand up for yourself? Why didn't you speak louder? Well, we actually have good reasons why we don't. And in the world of psychology, we understand that. And the opposite is true when we say, well, why did you act out? Why did you get so aggressive? Why did you scream? Why did you say horrible things? Why did you hit that person? Why did you assault them? In the world of psychology, we know why. We don't know everything because I don't know that there's any human science that knows everything, but we know the patterns. We know that abuse and neglect, whether it's verbal or actual physical or sexual abuse or neglect, we know the kinds of symptoms that people will have. We also know what's needed to break the cycle. What I've learned over 34 years in practice as a psychotherapist and having done a lot of work myself as a client is that love and belonging, safety, cooperation, and nonviolence are the best food for human beings. And when we're fed that food by the people around us, we thrive.
Mhm.
We can manifest our greatest selves. We learn then how to cooperate with other people and not be the center of the stage and not be missing, but be an equal in participation for a common good. And again, that's a bold outline. None of us does it perfectly because we're human, and that's part of what we're working with. But that doesn't mean that those aren't really necessary goals. And the opposite is true. If we're fed violence, if we're fed hatred, if we're fed discrimination, if violence is condoned, if people don't have good boundaries, if they withhold resources from one another, I call that low tech human relations and the other high tech human relations. If we're fed that bad food, we become symptomatic and we tend to repeat what we know.
That's exactly right. I watched one of your and I agree with everything you just said, and I've lived it because you're looking at somebody right now who actually broke that cycle of dysfunction in their family.
Beautiful.
And where that came from, I don't know. It was like a divine intervention. I
Mhm.
just got to the point that I was so sick of being unhappy and miserable and abused that I had to do something. And it involved me cutting ties with a lot of people, including family members. And when you grow up in a dysfunctional household, well, I didn't realize that we weren't normal.
Right.
I thought it was normal. And I watched one of your podcast interviews. I can't remember who it was with, but I learned a little bit about your upbringing. And I giggled a bit when I heard you say in one of those interviews that your family's dysfunction wasn't observable on the outside. And that comment sparked some reflection about my past. And I came to the conclusion that once I thought about it a little bit, our dysfunction, I think, was absolutely observable on the outside. The thing with me was I had no idea how dysfunctional we were back then. And so, did you have an awareness of that, or did it take you a while like it did me?
I had no awareness whatsoever, and I'm older than you quite a bit, and I think even when I was a child and when I was growing up and I was a teenager and in college, I was the first time I heard about psychotherapy, but when I was growing up, I was born right after World War II was over, and nobody talked about it. The first time I heard about World War II was on something on television,
Mm.
and the Holocaust. Nobody talked about it. Nobody talked about feelings. I don't have any memory as a child of being asked how I felt about anything. Maybe what flavor of ice cream I wanted was maybe the most inquiry into what might I might want or what resonated with me. We had no language, and you said that yourself, and that really resonated with me. I had no language for the emotional world, for behavior, for I had no sense of what a healthy family was, what an unhealthy family was, because we just didn't ever talk about that. It wasn't anything I read. We didn't study that in school. It's almost like you're living life behind, let's just say, a blue piece of glass. Everything just looks blue, and you just think that's the way the world is, and you have no idea that you're looking through a filter that actually does not reflect reality, does not reflect what's healthy until you take it off. And like you, I don't know why I was the one in my family also to really try to pop out of the trance that we were living in, but I was just driven from a very early age to know the truth about myself and to contact something, I didn't know what, but something that felt like it was deeply buried inside of me that I desperately needed access to, which I call my essential self or my real self or my higher self or however you talk about that.
My intuition always told me that I was not in the right place with the right people, even though some of those people were my family. I
Right.
never did quite feel like that I fit in.
Mhm.
And when I was my true self, I got in trouble for it.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so, and when you live that way for so many years, I mean, it absolutely does wreak havoc on your self esteem and how you perceive the world and your role in it. And so I have lived all of that. And no one ever talked to me about mental health or not even anxiety. If, I mean, when I was growing up, if I was really upset about something and if I showed it, I got in trouble for that. I lived that way for so long, and my intuition just always said, this something's not right. Something's not right here. And I was also raised to be a very jealous person. I was raised to be incredibly critical, judgmental, which really truly those things, those behaviors are embedded right into the rural landscape of where I grew up and in
Mhm.
that whole region. I just behaved the way that I was taught to behave. And when I was mean to somebody, I almost felt like I was on autopilot. I didn't
Mhm.
really mean it. I was just behaving that way because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. It just got to the point that it really, really, really started bothering me, and I acted on it. And when you need a teacher, that person will show up. And I suddenly found myself around better, more compassionate people, and it changed everything. It broke that intergenerational trauma. It broke it. It
Right.
wasn't easy, but it broke it. Sometimes I wonder if, I don't know, with the new with news being more accessible in this day and time than it was when you were growing up and when I was growing up, I often wonder, do you think that we're just now in a mental health crisis, or do you think we've really been there all along?
I think there might be truth in both statements.
Mhm,
Um, I think, because no one talked about mental health when I grew up, and to the extent that it was spoken about when I got a little bit older, it was really seen as something you shouldn't need. It was a sign of weakness to go and talk to somebody. Healthy people or good people or people who were successful didn't need that kind of thing. So
mhm,
there was a lot of stigma around mental health and around diagnoses rather than really just understanding we're hurting human beings and we need healthy human beings to help us heal. I think sexual abuse, I think physical violence, I think racial discrimination, and many of the things that we're suffering from so deeply collectively now as a society have been around forever.
mhm,
Um, I think there wasn't, though, perhaps, and I could be wrong, I grew up the way I grew up in the community I grew up in, and somebody else in another community might have a different experience, but I don't think there was the permission to act out the way we're seeing now. So I think the pain might not have been any less. Certainly, I've worked with people of all ages, and there's just as much abuse and neglect in people of my generation that I've also seen in people of a younger generation or midlife. So I don't know that any of that has changed, but I do think there's more societal permission at the same time, which is curious. And I think it's important to note that we're also calling it out as a society in a way we never have. So it's more flagrant. It's more observable from some of the highest levels of authority. And at the same time, we're talking about it and we're saying this is a mental health crisis in a way that we never did.
mhm,
I think we used to look at people and think that, the murderer was somebody who was mentally ill, or the person who abused their children was mentally ill. And while that needs to be spoken of and addressed, part of the theme of my book is that we are suffering collectively from ill mental health because we still condone things to be done to other people that we would never want to be done to ourselves.
mhm. You're right. And you've brought up sexual abuse a couple of times, and sexual abuse is so incredibly common. And according to data from RAINN, which stands for Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, every 68 seconds an American is sexually assaulted. Now, I know so many people who are victims of sexual assault, and this is what I find to be perplexing about those people. Each one of them has told me that it's happened to them more than once. And I've watched documentaries where victims report the same thing. And I
Mhm.
wonder, since I don't believe in coincidences, why do you think this happens?
It's so interesting that you asked that question because that's actually what I wrote my master's thesis on, believe it or not.
Really? Ooh,
Yeah,
I got cold chills. Really?
yeah. And I think there's two ways to look at that now, and there may be, further iterations of what we're talking about. But the two main things that come to my mind when you ask that question are this: when someone has been sexually abused as a child, you have to be overpowered to be sexually abused, whether someone has convinced you that you like it and you want it, or they offered you candy in exchange for whatever they did to you, or they held you down and hurt you in the process. However it happened, you were overpowered.
Mhm,
And there's an imprint of being overpowered that's left in the psyche. And for not for everyone, but for some people, and you can read about this in psychology books. I'm not saying anything that isn't common knowledge in the world of treatment of abuse. For many, many people, the imprint of powerlessness stays with them into adulthood or teenhood. So they're already set up not to resist or fight back because either resisting and fighting back brought them further harm, or no one believed them when they told, or they never got help for the psychological and emotional after effects of abuse. And so there's something that gets disabled in the psyche, which makes them, and this is the other half of it, that people who tend to look for others to abuse, children, teenagers, even adults to assault, have a sixth sense about who's vulnerable. Someone who acts very empowered and in charge of themselves, and they're going to fight back, they're not going to be the first person that a perpetrator looks for. They might still get attacked, but perpetrators have a sixth sense about who's most vulnerable, who they can manipulate, who they can overpower physically. And those two things fit together. So, what happens for many children who were sexually abused, they unknowingly become the target of victimizers later on. They're kind of singled out of a crowd of kids, or kind of corralled away from everybody, or bribed, or just simply assaulted. Does that make sense to you? Does that
Makes
help
total it
understand?
makes total sense, and it reiterates what I already thought because, again, many people have said that to me, and it was just a couple of weeks ago I was talking to someone, and this person told me that they had been sexually assaulted a few years ago, and that then it happened again, like a year later. And I'm like, "Why does this happen to people more than once?" And I've always thought it's gotta be a subconscious beliefs thing. And,
Mhm.
and then the overpowerment, geez, if that's embedded in your subconscious, and I think our subconscious controls, like, 90 something percent of our behaviors. So, we're acting a certain way, and a sexual predator can absolutely pick up on that.
Absolutely. And the other piece, and this has to do with all abuse, not necessarily just sexual abuse, but it's an important piece, is that going back to what we were talking about earlier about how abuse gets passed down, the dynamics of abuse get passed down. We tend, and again, you can read about this in other books on psychology, we tend to be attracted to what we know. And so you often see people, for instance, who get into relationships that mirror the dysfunctional or hurtful relationships they were in with their parents. Their father was a rager. They end up marrying a rager. Their mother was depressed. They end up marrying someone who's extremely depressed. And it's not because, and I just really want to emphasize this over and over again, it's not because there's something wrong with us or deficient with us. It's what we learned.
Mm,
And we have to give ourselves, both as individuals and as a country, and really as a species, the opportunity to learn something new. So, what that dynamic is, and I think many people can relate to this from their own experience. This was certainly true for me in my first marriage, that we tend to look for love from the people we didn't get it from originally, because we're still trying to get that parent, that angry parent, to see us and calm down and love us. We're still trying to get that depressed parent to come out of their room and pay attention to us. We're still trying to get the addict parent to stop drinking and be a functional adult. And so we tend to gravitate also to someone who might hurt us. And that is tragic.
mhm. And I've been there, and when you're abused until you have an awakening and develop that awareness and realize that what's happened to you isn't normal,
Right.
then you're gonna migrate towards, like you said, what you know, and it almost feels like a security blanket, and that's when it gets really messed up. And I didn't understand why all of my uh, intimate relationships were so dysfunctional and so abusive. Well, it was because that's what I had been taught. And
Right.
subconsciously, I was getting involved with those men, and I was just seeking something from them that I so wanted from my father.
Right. Exactly.
And that's
Exactly.
why, yeah, and that's why I dated a lot of men, I think, that were older than me.
Mhm.
And it's like they didn't treat me well, but for whatever reason, I felt safe. That was messed up. And it took me a really long time to figure all of that out. How can someone get, like, if they have been overpowered, let's just say it's sexual abuse or really any kind of abuse, what do you recommend that they do to start to maybe rewire their subconscious or to get past that?
I mean, the best access that I know for healing the trauma of overt abuse from other people, and especially the people we depended on, but it could be really anyone, is therapy. I mean, good therapy,
Yeah,
because inside of us, nobody was born a victim. Nobody was also born a perpetrator.
right,
There's a hurting place in us that has become either disabled or overempowered and dominating. I do think that the best therapy for trauma, for abuse and neglect, or any other kind of hurt at human hands, the best therapy I know is, the best treatment I know is some form of therapy. And there are many good forms of therapy. Um, there's art therapy, there's psychodynamic therapy, there's EMDR, there's hypnosis, there's inner child work, there's many, many different avenues of approach, and some people respond to one better than another. But when there's been abuse and neglect, the bottom line is, and I think EMDR is a really good avenue of treatment for for trauma, because when there is abuse and neglect, we take on negative beliefs about ourselves. I'm not lovable. I'm not worthy. I'm a loser. I'm stupid. I deserved it. It's my fault. We automatically take on some kind of belief from the way we're treated. So if you're treated lovingly and kindly with good boundaries and, appropriate responses and encouragement, you internalize basically good things about yourself. I am a lovable person. I deserve to be treated well. If you're not treated well, you take on the opposite. And that stays in there and it generates a set of coping mechanisms. Every child who's been hurt comes up with some way, and it's unconscious, and sometimes it's modeled on what they've seen around them. They come up with some way to cope with their pain. They become a people pleaser. They become withdrawn. They eventually become an addict. They become a workaholic. They become a rager. They become obsessed. They become highly anxious. They become agoraphobic. I mean, they become addicted. We could go on and on and on. And all of those symptoms are symptoms of harm done to them. They're not flaws. But we tend, and you brought up being raised in a very judgmental and critical environment, and I was too. But we live in that as a culture, that we criticize and judge people for their symptoms instead of having compassion and understanding for where they might have come from.
right.
And that's a lot about, what my book is about, is we don't have that as common knowledge. We don't teach psychology. We don't teach intrapsychic and family dynamics as a required course. And it actually needs to be, not because I want to impose that on anyone, because we need that to survive here.
Mhm. Oh, God, yes. I've said that forever. It absolutely should be a prerequisite with any educational program because understanding people, if you don't understand people and you don't have empathy and
Right.
you can't step into somebody's shoes and just see past your ego when they don't treat you the way that you think that they should, then you're going to live a pretty hostile existence. And I was that way for so long. I mean, I feel very confidently speaking on that. The best thing that I ever did was realize that I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a victim. And to have empathy for people and understand that there are people different from me and that my opinion's my opinion. I'm not right, I'm not wrong. It's just an opinion.
Mhm.
And to see everybody else that way. And that was really, really helpful for me. And through empathy, I was able to forgive the situations that I had been in and forgive those people that had hurt me. And that was a game changer. It was a total game changer. And if I hadn't done those things, if I hadn't done that inner work, then I really think that something irreversible would have happened to me.
I totally agree with you, and that's one of the reasons why I want to bring psychology and psychotherapy to the forefront of our awareness and national conversation. Because what you just illustrated was when you had a chance to heal from the harm that you had experienced, you could become a more compassionate and more open-minded, a more tolerant and a more cooperative human being. And that's the hope that
Mhm.
we could heal from our individual hurt, but we could also look at ourselves as a nation. And we're many, many, many of the people who immigrated here in the past over many hundreds of years fled poverty. They fled religious persecution. They fled war. They fled some kind of, really horrible conditions in other countries that made them want to leave their homes. And they brought their traumas with them at a time when we didn't talk about trauma and we
Mm.
didn't talk about the after effects of trauma. We just acted them out. And so we have generation upon generation of people who brought their traumas with them and have continued to perpetuate them through their own lives and their offspring and the generations to come. Now, that's not to say that we didn't also bring many strengths, many gifts, great creativity, drive for good, and all kinds of wonderful positive attributes. We did. And most of us have both. We have our wounds and we have our gifts. But the purpose of really healing the wounds, and you're just such a beautiful illustration of that in what you just shared about your own life, is that your gifts became available to you the more you healed what happened to you.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's what I want for America. That's what I want for all people. That's why I wrote the book, because we are at the effects. And let me say this, and it's not always a popular thing to say, um, we are at the effects of the traumas we have lived through as a nation over hundreds of years, and we're also at the effects of the traumas we've inflicted on other people.
Mhm.
And we have to know that they go hand in hand. I don't know about you, but I can say that out of my, the bad things that happened to me when I was young, I also wasn't the nicest person sometimes to other people.
Either.
You
Mhm.
know, I said hurtful things to people that I was jealous of, or, left somebody out the way I had felt left out. Um, and that's just part of how wounding repeats itself. So I think we have to have both compassion for the way that we've acted out on our wounds, but also accountability. Like to really be able to have the inner strength to take responsibility for what we have done that hasn't been good, both as individuals and as a nation.
Mhm. When I decided to practice forgiveness, because I knew that that was something that I couldn't skip over,
Right.
I made a list, and I can't remember how long that list was, but I swear there was probably 100 people on it, and I was number 1 on that
Beautiful.
list.
Beautiful.
I was number 1, and forgiving myself was one of the hardest things I ever did, and we still have to continue to do it, none of us are finished products. I mean, I say that all the time. Things
Right.
happen, and you have to continue to, forgive yourself,
Right.
and if you don't, people don't, I think, understand the true meaning of forgiveness. Forgiveness is for us. It's not for the person necessarily that hurt us. It's just there's a freedom that comes along with it.
Right.
that is just invaluable. And with that freedom brings so many wonderful things. And like you said a bit ago, it unlocked my gifts when I started healing. I'm a totally different person, really. I don't think the same. I don't view the world the same. And when I see somebody, I don't just immediately jump to those harsh judgments. And it just makes having that kind of awareness just makes such a huge difference.
It really does, and I think we're desperate for that awareness as individuals and as a country because but let's just stay with the individual for a moment.
Mm.
I don't know anybody who really doesn't want more love in their life. More
Right.
b more of a sense of belonging, more of a feeling that they have value to other people, that they I don't know anyone who doesn't want the people around them to be more cooperative, more understanding, more open-minded. We really all want these things, and yet we still live in a paradigm of such extreme judgment. Rather than looking at each other with compassion for where we might have come from, it's like, "What's wrong with that person?" And we're very quick as a society to condemn people, lock them up, and throw away the key, rather than really be committed to treatment. There are so many people who are incarcerated today or who are just at the bottom of the totem pole who don't have an opportunity or a chance or any positive feedback from the society in which they live to thrive, who could really be helped with a more compassionate view. I read a statistic, and I don't have the number in front of me, but that said that more than half of the prison population in America today are unhealed survivors of childhood trauma.
Oh, I have no doubt.
Right. And so, what would we be like as a country if we were actually committed to healing one another, to seeing the essential, beautiful, innocent baby that was born inside of each other and doing our very best to help that person? And it goes along with also, one of the things that I would really love to see in America and anywhere is, a lot of times children or spouses or people in workplaces don't come forward and talk about what happened to them for fear of retribution, for fear of not being believed, but also for fear that the people they depend on are going to get in trouble. Often children don't tell that they're being abused because all they know is their family. I think we need, as a society, to commit. Like, if a child comes forward and says, "My father's hitting me really hard with a blah blah," to look for how we can help that father before we incarcerate them or remove. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Oh, yeah, and no
commit.
one thinks like that. Most people don't think like that.
Right. But
Mhm,
we'd make it safe for children to tell, and we'd make it safe for adults to get help rather than just be seen as horrible people. And if I can, I just wanna say something about the perpetrators, because
mhm.
I talk about this a lot in my book, and I think it's not common knowledge that the world of psychology really does hold, and that is that, I talked earlier about the people who are overpowered in abusive and neglectful systems who become very passive and easily dominated and controlled, and manipulated. But the other half of the population who are hurt identify with the aggressor. It's a psychological term, identification with the aggressor, and they adopt the behaviors and the attitudes and the coping mechanisms of the people who hurt them. And those are the people who are so scared of their own vulnerability and so scared of being one down that they have to be one up. And they've role modeled themselves on the people that have hurt them, and they become the people who then hurt others. But inside of them, just like the person who's passive or submissive, is a victim that's not being treated. And we have to know that. Otherwise, we can't break the cycle of abuse if we just look at the worst, criminals and the people who perpetrate the worst atrocities, yes, they need to be stopped so that society can be safe from their behaviors, but we need to know as a society that there is a hurting child inside them or a hurting adult somewhere inside them who's been mistreated and who is acting out their pain also in a predictable way. And in psychological terms, we call them the identified patients,
Mm.
the ones who show their symptoms the loudest, the ones who are the most depressed, the most anxious, the most addicted, the most violent, the most hurtful. They are calling for help for the ills in the family of America. Just like the child who wets the bed or hits their brother or fails in school or joins a gang is calling for help. And I don't think it's an accident. The little that I read about the young man who shot at ex-President Trump, the little that I read was that he was a loner and he had been bullied.
Mm.
And this pattern just repeats and repeats and repeats. We have so many disaffected people in our society who don't feel like they belong, who don't get what they need from other people in terms of valuing and safety and belonging, especially, who act out their pain.
Right.
And this is a societal issue. It isn't just a family issue, it's a societal issue. And if we have people in positions of power who condone being bullies, who role model that as a way of trying to get their needs for power or whatever it is they want met, then that's the role model for so many people in our country. And
Mhm.
look where it gets us.
Oh, you're 100% right. And that leads me to something I would love to ask because I think this is the perfect time to ask this question. If you became the president of the United States of America tomorrow, how would you implement the healing principles of the best psychotherapy into policy? And what is the first thing you would do?
Well, there's probably, like, over 100 things on that list. So so
I'm
obviously,
sure.
we'll start at the top, and I don't know actually what's at the top, but one of the things that I would do, among many others, would be to really talk about there are so many experts in the field of nonviolent communication, nonviolent conflict resolution. There are experts all over the country doing this work. I would bring them to the highest levels of government, and I would have them facilitate Congress for one thing. I would not I would not allow people to act out on each other at the highest levels of government the way that if our children behaved this way in school, they'd be suspended.
Mhm,
They'd be referred for counseling. Somebody would say, "What's wrong in their family?" Or "What's wrong in their community?" Or "What happened to this kid that they're bullying other kids on the playground or threatening them or putting up, horrible things about them on the internet?" So I would bring that to the highest levels of Congress because I think immediately we need to role model that we are committed to working our differences out without violence, without verbal violence, without emotional violence, without threats of physical violence. And right now we have the opposite. Many, many people who have just varying and differing opinions have received death threats,
mhm.
have been assaulted. Um, and we can't go on like this. Nobody wants this in their own life. So I would say that not as like, we're going to now make it so that you have to abide by the rules of this facilitator, but like, can we heal our country? Can we bring in what we know works to help people actually heal each other?
Mhm,
Can we educate people? I mean, there's a whole educational piece that goes along with this, and, I could spend probably hours talking about it. But there's a whole educational piece that goes along with this that is and again, that we know so well from the world of psychology and psychotherapy, that people in families where the parents are fighting all the time, those children suffer and become symptomatic. And we, as a population in America, are suffering and becoming symptomatic more and more each day from the horrible rhetoric that's being batted back and forth between opposing parties. We are in a family of America. And so the first thing I would do would be really to educate everyone, not just lawmakers, but everyone, that it's actually in our best interest. We'll feel safer. We'll feel more, able to thrive in our own lives. We can depend on our government more if we see our leaders committed to working things out nonviolently. I've said this many times. I worked pretty much exclusively with children when I first started my practice. And what I found was that 99% of the children that got referred to therapy for things like I mentioned, bedwetting, aggression toward other kids, failure to perform in school, excessive fears, isolationism, and not being able to make friends. Um, 99% of those children were suffering from either ongoing conflict between their parents or their parents and another sibling, or their parents were in a conflictual divorce.
Mm.
That was it. That was the whole picture. They were suffering from the unresolved conflicts around them that they could not escape and could not do anything to stop. And so what I discovered was the work was with the parents.
Mhm.
Most parents, especially people who were in really conflictual divorces or their marriage was just falling apart, had no idea that their conflicts were affecting their children that way. They were so wrapped up in their own pain and their own drive to get whatever it is they wanted that they weren't getting, that they had no idea that their children were the fallout. And I don't know if some of our people in positions of authority and in the highest offices of government actually know that some of the symptomology we're seeing in the general populace is directly a result of this ongoing inability and unwillingness to cross the aisle and work things out for the good of America, for the good of all the people in America, just like the parents didn't realize that they needed to work out their conflict or separate peacefully for the good of their children and themselves. And this comes right out of family systems. We know this stuff, you
Right.
know.
Yeah, and that leads to what you say about healing the gap between love and politics, and I've never heard anyone put it that way before, but you really just summed it up with what you just said. What do you think the result would be if we accomplish that?
Well, one thing I first want to say is the result of not accomplishing that is what we're getting right now.
It's what we're getting right now. Oh, yeah,
Absolutely.
we've gotta it's like a poster child.
Right.
Yeah,
So
it's
I
a
think we
textbook
have to know
example.
that. I think we have
Mhm,
to know that. I think we have to know. I think it's not an accident that the word love is not part of politics, and people who try to bring it into the world of politics are poo-pooed.
mhm.
That happened with Marianne Williamson in particular when she talked about love on the debate stage. I mean, she was just talked about as being a witch or being, I don't know, spreading crystals around the podium. She was not taken seriously, and yet she had a vitally important message. And I'm not promoting Marianne Williamson or not right here. I'm just talking about love. Um,
Right, but there's a
and that
human component here.
there's a human component, and if we don't have love and belonging and safety and nonviolent conflict resolution as part of a national agenda, we will continue to have what we have, which is escalating.
Mhm,
Um, and the reason why I think it's been eliminated from politics in general is that you can't really have power over other people in a deleterious and selfish way if you allow them to advocate for love and belonging and equality and justice. You can't.
mhm,
And so what we have is in many ways, along with, and I just really want to emphasize this, There are so many wonderful people in America. There are people who give their time, give their service, give their money to help other people, to help their neighbors, who are good parents, who are working to clean up the environment, to working to help the educational system and the justice system. There are people doing amazing things all over this country and all over the world. They're not necessarily, though, in the highest positions of authority. So I think we have to know that some of what's happening in America are abuse family dynamics. It doesn't mean the whole family is corrupt or going down the drain, but we need to identify like the virus in the system if we're gonna bring ourselves back to health.
And I think if we flash forward to, say, a decade from now, what do you think America will look like if this gap continues to widen?
I think I don't know when we're gonna hit bottom. I hope we are hitting bottom and wanna rise from here, and
Mhm,
I think you and so many people like you and me with my book and so many other people who are speaking out about what we need to heal the great divides and bring ourselves back from threats of violence
mhm,
and the violence that's already happening. I think we're just gonna see more of the same, and I think it's frightening if we don't actually really start to listen to what could help.
mhm.
Just like, in a family system, if there's no intervention around abuse and neglect, and people are just being hurt with no way to escape or no way to get help or no way to get treatment for the after effects, they continue to become more and more symptomatic. And, worst case scenario, it evolves all the way to homicide and suicide.
Mhm.
And sometimes it evolves to a victim killing a perpetrator. And we're seeing some of that in our communities. We're seeing some of that in our country. So can we actually be honest about what we're seeing? And again, not it's really not about blame. It's about healing.
Mhm.
If and I say this too, I use the medical model because I think it makes sense to people. If your appendix is rupturing, you don't say, "I have a bad appendix." You go get help
Right.
and you take it out, right? So you don't die. And I think we have to look at our country the same way, that the most symptomatic people among us are calling for help for us to change the way we're treating one another.
We're definitely living ego-based.
Yeah,
When I say we, I'm referring to the country as a whole. It's definitely not rooted in love. It's absolutely rooted in ego, AKA fear.
right.
And I wanted to ask you that question about a decade from now, because I've often wondered, is this our rock bottom? Or when are we going to hit rock bottom? What's that going to look like? When is that going to happen? It just, I do not get wrapped up in politics, but again, it's the worst climate I've seen since I have been alive. At this point, I'm raising an eyebrow. And I don't watch the news. I stopped watching the news a long time ago because that causes me to worry, and I think that worrying is basically the same thing as praying for what you don't want, and so I will avoid that at all costs.
Mhm.
Don't watch the news. I watch just enough to stay informed because, I mean, I've got a degree in political science. I really don't know why. Well, I do know why I majored in political science. I didn't want to have to do math. I'm terrible at math. And so I just picked a major that I knew I wouldn't have to take a lot of math classes. And I did learn quite a bit about politics when I was in college, and so I've just seen such a huge change from when I was studying political science until now. It's just really not looking good at all for the home team here in America. And when I got your book and you came into my life and you described America as kind of like a dysfunctional family, then I just started putting the pieces together. And you're right. You're absolutely right. And dysfunctional families always destroy themselves from within. Since I had never viewed our country through that lens, that makes, I mean, it's brilliant when you look at it like that. And it almost makes me feel a little bit better because I know there's got to be a solution. There's got to be a solution, but it is the collective. We're all going to have to get on board. I mean, it's like your book, America in Therapy. And if we view America as one big family, it's like, I wonder how can everyone get along despite their differences and despite the government's broken systems right now?
Well, I mean, there's so many things to talk about and, have so many different angles that I look at, what we need to change or what I think works from the world of psychology that could be applied to a country. But let me say something very specific
Mhm.
that we could look at in terms of large scale operations in government, but also in our own lives. Because I think most of us today really want to feel like there's something we could do. And a lot of people feel really powerless to impact the larger systems that are dysfunctional or broken or hurtful. Um, and so I'm going to quote something that I heard one of my instructors in graduate school say that was very, very important. And he was just teaching a class in couples therapy. And most couples come to therapy when they're really doing poorly, right? They're fighting, they can't get along, they're on the brink of divorce, and they're really invested in having the therapist say that their partner is the one who's wrong,
Right.
right?
Right. So,
We're
yeah,
all
oh, yeah. Yeah.
right? We're all
Mhm.
like that. We all think the problem is with somebody else,
Mhm.
and we want the therapist to set them straight, or we wanna yell at them louder until they hear that we're right and they're wrong. The problem is, of course, that they think the same way. Our partner feels the same way, that they're right and we're wrong, or we're not hearing them the way that they wanna be heard. Um, and what he said was that in all of his experience working with couples over many, many years, the couples that did the best, that had the best outcome for themselves and for their relationship, for reconnecting in a healthy way with one another and having their marriage be sustained and thriving, were those people who focused on taking responsibility for their own behavior and stopped pointing the finger.
There you go.
And I think it's pivotal. I also think it's one of the hardest things for people to do.
Mhm.
And so if you say that, therapy is for the weak or therapy, you should be able to just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, forget it. Actually becoming someone who's totally responsible for themselves, who stops pointing the finger of blame, is one of the hardest things, takes the most courage, the most inner strength, and the most ability to tolerate our own discomfort and vulnerability to do. So, what does that look like? It looks like if I'm in a disagreement with you and maybe translate everything I'm saying, both into how we are with the people in our lives, but how our governing bodies could be with one another. People
Mhm.
in positions of authority could be in the way that they treat the people that they have to work with. So, I'm talking on both levels at the same time, the microcosm and the macrocosm. If we focus, and this is all what really good mental health is about, okay? If we focus on restraining our most dysfunctional impulses to yell, to roll our eyes, to walk out and slam the door, to say nasty things, to put each other down, or to become physically violent, if we restrain ourselves, that's the beginning. And I can't emphasize this one enough because if we don't do that, it's not safe to talk. If
Mhm.
I know you're going to scream at me or call me names or threaten me or slam the door in my face, then how safe am I going to feel to be vulnerable with you, to be honest with you, to be direct with you, to ask you for what I need, and to be accountable for myself? I won't feel safe. And if I'm that way, you won't feel safe, and we won't get beyond it. And so, right now, in so many of the conflicts that we're witnessing, at the highest levels of government, nobody's safe.
Right.
There are threats, coming to people's homes, um, and to people's partners and people's families, and people having to have security around their homes or move because they're getting death threats. So we can't even get beyond that. So there has to be a basic commitment to restraining ourselves from any kind of violence. And I want to reiterate, it takes incredible strength and courage and a commitment to the common good to do that. And so that's one of the first things. And the next one is, in terms of like what the instructor was saying, being responsible for ourselves and stop pointing the finger is like, okay, who am I being? What's my agenda? Do I care about you? Or am I just talking about myself? Which
Mhm.
is true for most of us, right? We're
Right.
totally conditioned to believe that what we want and what we think and what we say is the right thing, and everybody should listen to us.
Mhm.
Um, but so who am I being? Am I being open-minded? Am I willing to restrain myself? Can I look at myself and take responsibility for my part in the conflict? I had a I've had people I've seen everything in my offices, and I've probably done everything myself,
Mhm.
so
Right.
not holding myself up as a paragon of perfection because we're not, and that's part of it, is to be willing to say, "You know what? I didn't do that well. I shouldn't have spoken that way to you," or "I said something that was unkind," or, "I did roll my eyes when you were talking, and I don't want you to do that to me."
Mhm.
So taking responsibility for my part in it, and what I've seen in my own life and with all the people that I've worked with, if one person models that, the other person is much more likely to follow suit. If I attack, you're gonna defend. If you
Mhm.
attack, I'm gonna defend, and all we're gonna get is attack and defense, and that's, of course, what we're seeing around us.
Mhm.
So one person has to have the courage to say, "No more. I'm going to listen to you. I may not agree with you, but I'm going to listen to you with an open mind, the way that I want you to listen to me.
Mhm.
I'm not gonna roll my eyes. I'm not gonna call you names. I'm not gonna threaten your family members. We're gonna cross the aisle for the good of the family of America, or we're gonna cross the aisle to each other if we're partners for the good of our relationship and our children."
And I think that based on everything that you just said, we cannot make assumptions about someone in a position of power in terms of their level of emotional intelligence, because if you don't if you're not able to manage your emotions in a healthy way, then that's where you stay rooted in ego. You blame everything and won't take responsibility. And one of the biggest leaps that I made in my transformation was admitting that I was at fault for X, Y, and Z. And the more I worked on increasing my emotional intelligence, then I started seeing things a lot differently. And I really do see a lack of emotional intelligence at every angle in the political realm right now.
Right. And I think it's a huge escalation in our wounding just taking over.
Mhm.
Just taking over and being center stage and creating drama, and we get so invested in who's right and who's wrong and who's good and who's evil and who's gonna win and who's gonna lose, and we know in the basic family structure that those dynamics destroy the family.
That's right.
Partner is committed to dominating the other, they don't have a healthy relationship and their children suffer. If
Mhm.
Right? It's when we come together and we really have compassion for where each other comes from, and we can listen to what the other person really needs. And one of the things that really moved me was, I read an article about the Braver Angels, which is a grassroots organization that brings people from opposing parties together to talk.
The
and just
Braver Angels?
Braver Angels, yeah, and apparently it's a national organization, it's a grassroots organization, and there are other organizations. I heard of another one now that I forget the name of, but there are other people committed to really trying to bring people across the aisle in their own lives so that they can hear their neighbors better or their family members who are from a different party, better. And one of the things that this one woman who was quoted in the article said that when we were able to just sit down and listen to each other in safety, we realized that we weren't that different, that
Mm,
we all really wanted the same things.
yep.
And that was so moving to me because, when we are just invested in attack and defense, we'll never hear that.
Mm-mm. No. When I was in college and I was working on that political science degree, my college professors taught us that the average American voter is uninformed. What have you learned as a psychotherapist that you believe the average citizen doesn't know?
Well, that's kind of what my whole book is. It's really
Right.
that I think the average citizen really doesn't know how our psychology works, how family systems can either affect us for better or for worse, how brainwashing takes place, how people become passive or how they become aggressive. We don't really understand the roots of that. We don't understand that inside the perpetrator is a victim. We don't understand that some of our most symptomatic family members and societal members are actually calling for help
Mhm,
for the poor family dynamics that we've created here in America and that we perpetuate. And I think this trend toward censoring books and not allowing people to have a voice or attacking people who are demonstrating peacefully for human rights are all ways of silencing us from having the voices that we actually need to hear. We
mhm,
need to hear what we did to the Black people. We need to hear what we did to Native Americans. We need to know that we have never passed the Equal Rights Amendment. We need to know what some of these discriminatory policies are. Again, not to shame and blame or hate anyone, but to correct the dynamics that we're perpetrating here in the country, perhaps believing that they're the right thing to do, but really know what the after effects are because we're seeing the after effects in the news. And
mhm,
the assassination attempt that just happened is a perfect example.
mhm. Oh, yeah, it is, and I really don't think that, the vast majority of the American people, well, people in general, and I mean, I could be wrong, I don't think a lot of people realize how brainwashing works.
Right.
You and how it happens, and I actually had someone say to me, this was not too long ago, I kinda miss, seeing Donald Trump on the news. I kinda miss hating him." And I was like, "Wow." Because people seem to be addicted to either hating somebody or even loving somebody. And it's like, that's where I kinda see some brainwashing going on in this day and time. And a lot of people just don't really realize what's happening there.
Well, I think that goes back to the very first thing you talked about when you asked me about the re-evolution of our psychology,
Mhm,
because we have been playing this play of good guys and bad guys forever.
mhm,
It's part of our ego nature, it's part of our conditioning, it's part of our unconscious. It's part of the stories we've heard, it's part of the stories we tell. We love to have heroes, um, and the hero conquers the bad guy. But I think what we really need to know at this point in human history is that the bad guy has nuclear weapons. The bad guy can pollute the environment or cut down the trees or feed us food that is carcinogenic. And we have to do something different than just keep investing in this play of the good guys and the bad guys and educate ourselves. I don't know how to say this strongly enough that if we're committed to healing the wounds that create both victims and perpetrators, we can stop the cycle of war.
mhm.
And I think our sustainability as a human race actually depends on that right now.
Oh, I agree 100%. And this has been a very enlightening and informative discussion. And I thank you so much for being on the show today. And I do not want to, we focused on this book of yours, but you've actually written two more books.
Right,
You've written three total.
right.
Yeah. And what's the title of the other two? I just want people to make sure that they can find you and they can buy your books.
Oh, well, thank you so much. The first
Yeah.
2 were really about my own healing journey, but I think a lot of people can resonate with some of the things that I talk about, and those books are called A Light in the Darkness and Into the Fire.
And are they available everywhere, like Amazon or?
Mhm. Amazon.
Okay.
Well, I think all the major booksellers. I have
Okay.
just retired from my practice, and I'm really focused on writing and speaking about these things and, contemplating writing a sequel to America in Therapy because, of course, you can't put everything in one book. So
Right, right. I know, right? And so people, can they book you for keynote speaking and
absolutely.
okay, perfect. And do they do that through your website?
Yes, you can contact me in several places on my website. I'm happy to respond to anyone who contacts me. You can reach me at my business email, which is phyllis@phyllisleavitt.com. So yes, and I welcome and even just to have a conversation with someone, I welcome that. So feel free to contact me. I have lots of, as you mentioned, I have lots of videos on YouTube. I have lots of videos on and blogs on my website, and I'm on all the social media. But right now, my book is really the main thing. I think I've condensed a lot of what I've wanted to say in that book. It doesn't cover everything, but I think it really provides a basic foundation for a new approach to
Mhm.
hope and healing for this country and for all of us.
Well, this has been wonderful, and I know that so much information. People are going to love this, and they're going to be able to hopefully see everything through a different lens. And I really, really encourage all of our listeners to read this book. What I've read of it, it is very eye opening. I can't wait to read it from cover to cover. I have so many new books from all of my podcast guests. I don't know how I'm ever going to get through them because they all seem so good. I want to read them all, but it's like there's no time. So, is there anything that you want to, any closing statements for the people that are listening? Anything you want to say to our listeners?
Let's not give up hope. We can all make a difference. Seriously, just by being kind to the people around you, you make a difference. And the other big thing I would say is if you're hurting, get help. Talk to somebody. It doesn't have to be a therapist. It's great if you can talk to a good therapist. Talk to a friend. Um, just reach out because I think a lot of us feel like we're just supposed to take care of our pain ourselves.
Right.
And most of our pain came from hurt with other people. And the best place to heal it is with safe other people.
Hmm. That's excellent advice. And I'll piggyback off everything that you just said and throw in my 2 cents. I just want everybody to know that it is absolutely impossible to argue with someone who has no desire to be right. And so, in that moment, when you disagree with somebody, if you can just hold back and think about where they're coming from, see them as being from the same source as you create a significant amount of peace by just not vocalizing your opinion in that moment. Just, hey, say something like, well, I've never thought about it from that perspective before, and just let it go. It's all the arguing and this wrapped up in right and wrong when there's really no such thing as right and wrong. I mean, it's all relative. And so I think that if people could just make that tiny shift in thinking, that we would get just a little bit closer to your vision and your approach to love and healing this country.
Right. I
Yeah.
think that's beautiful advice because we just hold so tight to our bone, right? We don't want to share it. And really, another thing that I heard from one of my instructors was, do you want to be right or do you want to have a relationship? And I think we all really want to have loving and satisfying relationships.
Right. Right. I mean, love really, when you get right down to it, is what everybody wants.
Right.
So let's just stay focused on that and not try to get so far away from it. Because every time we make a decision based out of ego, then we get further and further away from what we really want. And hey, how much sense does that make? It's not even logical. It's like self-sabotage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So, Phyllis, thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and I can't wait for this episode to air. So, because I know everybody's going to love it.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for your beautiful contribution to the whole conversation.
The Thought Snob Podcast with Paula Swope has been brought to you by Thought Snob Media in association with Special Purpose Studios. All production, mixing, and sound engineering by me, Will Swope. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please take a few seconds to give us 5 stars and leave a review. See you on the next Thought Snob Podcast with Paula Swope.